Welcome back to the session number 20. Um, in this session, I would, I guess, re emphasize on the part that Taoism teaching uh, basically tells you to look beyond what appears to be for what actually is. Of course, that would be the choose finding a long journey, lifelong journey. You may or may not even get to the end and to find what is exactly the choose because it appears in many different ways and depends on your own, let's say, upbringing, education, life experience, your reading, your traveling, and all that. You probably come up with different conclusions. And I would like to I guess in this session, to begin with a new analogy. Um, for those who paid a little more attention to the art history, in particular the European art history, there was one particular painting by a Swedish artist, which basically was showing how uh, the new elite of the British rising empire, how the people were decorating their house with the paintings, basically all over the place, up and down several layers on each wall. And apparently, the Swedish artist was mocking the British, um, which actually it became sort of tradition even in America. Although this was a place collectively from all different European states, but eventually the British colonial influence dominated the early history of America. So even as of today, when you see the residence architecture, dominantly colonial style, and the furnitures inside these houses, a lot of them uh, are, and some of them still wore the colonial or somewhat Victorian style, right? So, with that, you apparently would not be surprised to see the same way um, ours decorate a house in America, right? So, some of those, still in part of let's say Upper East Side of New York and some part of specifically let's say the Garden District of New Orleans, they still have this tradition, quote unquote tradition, where the last name still means something. Like who got more money earlier, than others. Those still matters, right? So when you go into those households, you would not be surprised to see uh, a lot of portraits on display, basically just telling you, starting from the first generation who hit jackpot. Of course, all this whatever effort paid off, hit the jackpot, and they became rich, right? So you would basically be led on a tour, you know, passing through all these portraits of their ancestors. But given the history of America, you know how many generations could it be? Uh, if it's by the, I guess, the standard of European history, the old money in America cannot be that old. If you have like 10 generations of dukes in, let's say, Britain, uh, what's the, American old money, right? Um, so you would see lots of art decorating the house. See, that's the major difference. Arts in ancient China was not to decorate anything. Okay, and I guess I mentioned many times. I need to clarify here with a little explanation. When I keep mentioning about the Chinese elite, I did not mean to promote that certain social standing or I guess the privilege, legally, socially, and all that. That was not the point. The ancient China, once again, I'm going back to the concept of China. China was supposed to be the center of civilization for what? Specific for edification, right? So the civilized nation, such as the old China, did not care for the violence, never was for like occupying of neighboring countries by force. You don't find that in the Chinese history. Chinese never provoked anything, was always reacting to protect its own interests within the border. So that was the civilization, and that was basically accomplished, by design through edification. And who was I guess, the force to, execute that edification? Primarily the Chinese elite, which, by that, we already repeated many times, was those came through the 3 levels of royal court official credential exams and became the royal court commissioned officials, right? So this is the unique culture of China. The ancient China did not exist in any other countries except for Vietnam and Korea. They adopted, the same system, not in Japan. So nevertheless, in such I guess, a system, nobody was above and beyond the rules or the laws of Mother Nature. Basically, everybody just have to follow the life cycle span, I guess, system from boom to bust, everybody. So in the Chinese history, there was no such thing as the divine blood, that actually just, runs through forever, generation after generation. Basically, when your empire is gone, the whole royalty is gone. Okay, there's no royal blood that would, basically coexist in the next empire. No. So it's not like in Europe, basically, it doesn't matter whatever changes the system, the royalties stay, intact. No. In the Chinese system, basically, you have your, I guess, glorious time, but then, hey, when it's time to go, you go, because you're gonna clear the space for the next whoever coming through. Now, on the Chinese elite, they're the ones stay for 1,000 years. It doesn't really matter whoever started a new empire, the Chinese elite state, but generation after generation, they all have to, take the exam and pass the exam. For a lot of them, that could take 20, 30 years before they finally prevail from the final exam and became eligible for the royal court commissioning, right? So that Chinese elite status was never hereditary. No, it doesn't pass on automatically from one generation to another. You have to earn it. So that's the Chinese system. That's why in the early, I guess, stage of the European Enlightenment period, some French thinkers thought the Chinese system had the democracy, which, of course, in that sense is like, regardless your background, your upbringing, the social standing of your, I guess, parents, didn't matter. It was fair before the exam. Okay, take the exam, you pass, and hey, you become a Chinese elite. Welcome to the club. That was the system. But then your children, your grandchildren, they're gonna have to go through the same system. If they pass, they became officially a Chinese gentleman. So that's what I'm talking about, right? Was that system Taoism teaches you I guess somehow it was easier than contemporary China today, because hey, uh, your income is set, okay, by your royal court salary, and if you have more than that, when your expenditures start to show that's not a match, that caused the I guess the question, because there's this government agency created to monitor everybody's behavior, and they do crack down all the time on the corruption. So there you go. You got your royal court salary. It's humble salary, but it's enough to feed yourself and your family. And you don't need to worry about the housing, because as long as you're still the royal court official, unless you get caught on something and then either you got your head chopped off or got jailed, and of course they take everything back. You won't have anything left personally in your belonging. But unless that happens, you always have a roof provided by the royal court, you know, along with the salary. In Chinese, it was called Lu Mi. That's what it means, the royal court salary in terms of rice. Just so happened my cat has that name today, Lu Mi. In any case, the whole point is, if you just concentrate on doing your job as a royal court official, to promote the well-being, the best interests of the commoners, and nevertheless, in that way, you serve the ultimate interests of the royal court, the emperor. So there's no uprising, and you just sit there and collect the tax from those commoners. Everybody will be happy, right? So one, you don't own the house. If you are a Chinese elite, you don't own the house, never do. And two, you don't really decorate that house with some, quote unquote arts, because basically, for Chinese elite, what is art? It's something created for and by the Chinese elite themselves. What's to decorate a house? No, what you do is you practice all that, the calligraphy and landscape genre, ink, brush painting, and all that is to help you as a means to self-purify and self-improve as a study. So the result displayed on the walls, right? But you won't see two paintings stacking on top of each other on the same wall. Never in a Chinese household. Why? Because a Chinese painting cannot be displayed right next to another painting for a good reason. Okay? The big difference between the Chinese painting and the Western European painting, if you, practice a little bit, then the European art, the European school of visual arts are used to be called fine arts. The perspective, they had a vanishing point there and then extend, right? And typically the composition of all the European paintings, this was long before America was even born. So you would see the whole space of the canvas completely filled up with all the specific objects or figurines or portraits, whatever, fill up the space. So that is very specific. That is very particular. Of course, basically in the early days, it was either to promote the religious interest by telling the Bible stories, or basically, the artists hired by the nobilities to, promote their divine bloodline and stuff like that, the glory. So those, of course, they stack up on each other and fill up the wall, just like the composition of an oil painting or watercolor fill up the entire canvas or paper space. A wall can be filled up with a dozen paintings. Well, if you get used to it, generation after generation, it looks okay. I mean, what's wrong with that, right? Try that on the Chinese painting. Each wall, you can only place one Chinese ink brush painting. Why? The Chinese ink brush painting, first of all, let's talk about the composition. The perspective was not just one vanishing point, it's actually multiple. And it was more from, it's not a bird view, but still looking down from high top of the mountain, of a mountain, looking down. So it was this panoramic view all over. So it was multiple vanishing point. So when you look at the ancient Chinese painting, it's totally different from the Western. That's one. Two, the Chinese art composition always require quite a proportion of blank space to be preserved. And there are many functions with that reserved blank space. One, that is to represent the space in between, let's say a mountain. So what's the basic difference between what they call the North Song dynasty and the South Song dynasty in the landscape genre ink brush painting? The North Song dynasty was the Song Empire while back, located in the north part of China. But because of harassment, military challenge by the Mongolians repeatedly over a decade, then a century, then the Song Empire moved and relocated to the south, right? So that's what it was called later as the South Song Empire or dynasty. So in any case, the big difference between the two, because the emperor of the most important or the last, I guess, the Song Emperor himself was a great artist himself. Okay, he created calligraphy of his own font, very different from everybody else, and the way he set up his own Royal Art Academy, basically, he would give pick a sentence out of any very well-known poetry, and then test the artist and challenge the artist to come up with a painting, to reflect the meaning of that one sentence taken from randomly any poetry. And that has been very famous in the Chinese art history. And, basically to tell you the context of a painting to be enforced by the poetry. So at least since then, for you to be able to do a Chinese ink brush painting, you got to be able to come up with your own poetry, presented in good literature, calligraphy, and then, of course, the painting itself. But once again, coming back to the difference between the North and South Song dynasties in painting alone, was when they moved to the South, they see more, because in the North, not too much water. So they never saw much, fog as they did experience in the South. And all that fog, between that, that big space between the mountains, educated them, and they realized they got to reserve some space. So that is artistically. But philosophically, the Chinese elites hate to fill up the rooms with the specifics, because once you do that, you limit your imaginations to nothing but what the image represents itself, right? So when you have the rooms preserved, you can let your imagination take over, where the reserved blanks becomes, the extension of what the artistic image is portraying, right? So with all that, in a Chinese ink brush painting in the landscape genre, you see lots of space. The same rule actually applies in the Chinese calligraphy. So you will see they intentionally use what they call the dry brush stroke to create the blanks, blank space in between what they wrote. So when you see the brush of inks does not fill up the whole thing, that's by design, intentionally, right? So when you have all those, obviously you will not fill up the space of a wall with more than one painting. But calligraphy, yes, you do have two, because it's called couplet a lot of time, because it takes the first half and second half to be a complete, in context. And a lot of Chinese elite, they hang that, calligraphy pieces on their wall to remind themselves what they need to work on. For instance, if I am an official, court official, and I lose my temper, a lot more than what I should, so the first thing I need to do to remind myself is put a model in a calligraphy piece. This could, if it is horizontally displayed, lots of times just one, not two, okay? But if vertically, that's two, couplet, the first half, second half. And the good format is basically one on the top, and then the couplet goes on the left hand and right hand side, and that becomes the complete in format. So basically you say this as the first half, that as the second half, and then you end with the one on top. Typically it would be like 7 or more characters on, each of the couplet, and 4 on the top, 4 characters, right? So if I wanted to remind myself not to lose my temper, I may just have one piece, 4 characters, or sometimes 2, or sometimes just 1, to tell myself, control your temper, right? Things like that. Or you can, basically in your own house, you put something that's very, very subtle, but very, very deep, right? It looks, it appears to be something purely just talking about the landscape, Mother Nature, right? The wind, the rain, the flower, either the dead flower or the baby, booming flower, waiting to be, not flower, but, waiting to be blossom or whatever. But that's all analogy, okay? That is all talking about the life experience or even the political life. When you see something, either that's a, artistic image from a painting or just a poetry sentence, hanging on the wall, saying something about last night it rained so hard, the wind was blowing unbelievably, and giving you such a, bittersweetness kind of, poetry image. You think that's only talking about the Mother Nature, the 4 seasons, or whatever, the natural scene? No, they are actually insinuating, okay, either the court, political career that they, at the stage where they just experience, or some specific, events they're referring to. But that recorded the state of mind, when they created this art. And some of them survive, others they probably just destroyed. No good. So you see, this is a constant and almost indefinite, process of self-purifying and improving. And everything you basically display on your wall is reflecting that state of mind where you are with that study. So that's not a decoration per se. And you want to be very careful. Let's say you were walking, in a used to be like a very high scale place in Italy or in France, right? You look up, all that ceiling completely painted, covered, no space left. And then you look at the wall, lots of painting, and painting, basically stack up, against each other. Okay, so if you came from a civilization where you don't see arts as ass-kissing means, to make somebody happy, created by such, next to slave artists, basically just doing, to stuff their stomach, then you don't really come away impressed by looking at all that, filled up space with the very specific image of some very particular ideas. Because the Chinese ancient civilization, apparently, according to Taoism teaching, never believed in that. Now, with all this, what does that tell you? That tells you a society promoted certain value and edify, right? I will talk about the edification for the Chinese illiterate in the next session. But the education was pretty much limited to the Chinese elite, who has this job or task to edify the same values they picked up, from the training, and it came through the 3-level exams to become qualified royal court officials. And in the meantime, what do you think the Chinese emperors had to do? They have to study all their life even more than the Chinese elites, because not only when they were little kids, they were hired, I guess they were taught by the best masters, was established and recognized credentials and hired by the royal court to teach the young princes to make sure that they know more than the Chinese elites did. But even after they became the crown prince, and then eventually came to power and became the emperors, still every week, at least once a week, if not twice, they had to take the classes from those masters. And that was officially their duty. They could not say no. Okay, so that's almost like a law. That was the Chinese emperors. Okay, so I want to say all the Chinese emperors in the ancient Chinese history, all of them could practice calligraphies. Some of them did in painting, but all of them, because that's something you have to be able to do, because you constantly will have to, show. You cannot be, I guess, bringing the shame to yourself when you really have this very crappy handwriting, right? So you practice. And calligraphy is not just about the handwriting. It actually is a good means of self-purifying and self-study means, again. So anyway, with all that, I'm just trying to differentiate between the two different systems, right? And the system, apparently, the old one, the ancient Chinese system, promote, edify the core values, and then whereas the Taoism teaches you, do not chase after the vanity, just concentrate on things actually matter. So what actually matter? I mentioned it several times. In Chinese, it was called 穷则独善其身，达则兼济天下. So that is the responsibility, at least for a Chinese elite. Before you reach the position to help the whole world out there, at least do the self-purifying study and self-improvement study. Don't be a jerk. Don't be a burden for the society. The society collectively will be such a much better society if everybody followed that rule. Okay, the education, the edification, and once again, I'll leave that part for the next session. Until then, ciao.